Here we go. All right. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Popular Music Books in Process series, a joint project of IASPM US, the Journal of Popular Music Studies, and the Pop Conference. I'm Carl Wilson, one of the series organizers, along with Kimberly Mack, Francesca Royster, Gus Stadler, and Antonia Radolf, as well as our co-founder, Eric Weisbart, away this year in Sweden. You can find our whole calendar on the IASPM US website under the Journals tab, and get on the mailing list by contacting Francesca. You can also catch up on videos of all of our past sessions on Eric's YouTube channel, including last week's great conversation between Evelyn McDonnell and Ann Powers about Joan Didion and Joni Mitchell. Next week, December 12th, at the same time, we'll have two writers with exciting new books on the histories of college, community, and independent radio stations, Catherine Rye-Jewell and Robin James. But this week, we're excited to have Peter Coviello here to talk about his new book of essays, Is There God After Prince? Dispatches from an Age of Last Things, published by University of Chicago Press in conversation with our own Gus Stadler. Before we start, let me just give you a quick overview of their biographies. Peter Coviello is the author of 6 books, including Make Yourselves Gods, a finalist for the 2020 John Whitmer Historical Association Best Book Prize, Tomorrow's Parties, a 2013 finalist for a Lambda Literary Award in LGBT Studies, and Long Players, a memoir selected as one of ARTFORUM's 10 best books of 2018. He taught for many years at Bowdoin College and since 2014 has been at the University of Illinois Chicago, where he is professor and head of English. And Gustavus Stadler is William R. Keenan Professor of English and Director of the Herford Center for the Arts and Humanities at Haverford College. He's the author of 2 books, most recently 2020's Woody Guthrie, An Intimate Life, as well as essays on music, sound, and literature in Al Jazeera, Public Books, Social Text, and other places, and in the forthcoming Purple Rain and the Black Star volume edited by Daphne Brooks. He is currently coordinating a public memory project about the now defunct State Correctional Institute at Graterford outside Philadelphia. As always, please post your questions as you think of them in the chat sidebar. And in the last part of the session, Antonia will use them to call on you for the Q&A. We also encourage you to use the chat for comments and conversation, and we'll remind our participants our speakers, to please ignore the chat during your presentation so we can leave everything there to be dealt with in the Q&A. We'll send them a copy of the transcript later so they won't miss anything. And I think that's all you need to know. So please, Gus and Peter, take it away.
Well, thank you very much. Gus, it's good to see you.
I was struggling to unmute. It's good to see you. Yeah, I'm so happy that we were able to do this, and I'm really looking forward to talking with you. And I just, as you know, love the book, and I want everybody here to get a real flavor for it. So if they haven't already read it, so I hope you'll now share some of it with us.
Hey, Gus, I'll be very happy to. Before I do again, thank you for doing this, and thanks everybody for having me, which is very, very kind thing to do. As with many things, I feel like my relation to the writing about music as like its own set of practices and specialties, my own relation to it is sort of amateurish, and that makes me appreciate a lot that you'll have me here. I'll just read as we were talking beforehand. You never want to break 10 minutes really in reading, so I'm going to read briefly, and I'm going to read a little bit from the introduction of the book so you can hear what it's about a little bit, and then I'll read some from the very beginning of the essay about Prince. So I'll just say the book is a collection of essays, and what it takes up are a variety of objects, and it's the thing that it circles around a lot is what can it mean to love the things that we love, or feel agitated by the things we're agitated by, or hate the things that we hate, the objects, and to want to talk about them, and to want to think about them, and to want to exchange them. What can it mean to do all those things in a time of ruin and collapse, and in a time of escalating calamity, which one could mean in reference to the imagination of the climate in 2050, but not only that, to what feels like the inexorable fascist sequence, a lot of other things that appear to be moving toward their worldly ends that's indexed by a lot of things. And I'm sort of interested in what states of apprehension prevail there and what kinds of attachments to objects we have and what they do. So that's the general frame of the book. This is how the book starts. It's in a little introduction called Praise Songs and Descants. It starts like this. So, and in ways that you'll see, it's also very much a pandemic book. So, say you're staring at a screen. Say that there you drowsily lie, phone entranced, a glassy vacancy settling in behind your eyes. Say a fogged numbness of spirit has come creeping over you, coiled itself into your vertebrae, your lungs, and say, this is how one dim shut-in night you run hard into a video of a band playing a new song of theirs live in the studio of some West Coast radio station. It all unfolds in the familiar way. The singer steps to the mic, delivers a few verses, and there it is. That small inward flutter, guitars, a few silvery chords, and something prickles along the surface of your skin. A synapse or two misfires. There's a hitch, an infinitesimal jump in your blood. And would you look at that? Now you're awake. What follows is a somewhat long description of Wussy playing a great song of theirs at a radio station in Seattle, which I won't read, but I'll go to the next part, which just says, encounters such as this, the one with this Wussy video, which I watched about 8,000 times in the pandemic. Encounters such as this stand at the soft, pierceable heart of the essays assembled here. They pivot in their differing ways around matters of love, sorrow, and what such things might come to when it sounds so much like the world is ending. Each, after its fashion, wonders what it can mean to love trifling things like books and records, and to do so even now, in the midst of worlds so glutted with calamity, wreckage that keeps scaling with vertiginous rapidity from the sadly personal out to the political, the planetary, then abruptly back again. Each, after its fashion, tries to get some hold on just what it is that transpires in the charged space between our wearied workaday selves and the beguiling little objects that, on the better days, keep us attached to life. I think of it like this. There are the worlds that make us, full of malignity and avarice, exploitation and struggle and halting moments of reprieve. And alongside these, there are the worlds we try to make, patched together out of scraps of this and that, texts and playlists, sex and talk, ardor and sorrow, tracing their tight circuits around our lives. One sustained, implicit proposition of this book is that one thing criticism might do, or try to do, is chart the ways certain cherished things, songs, poems, movies, etc., fold these worlds together and for a blazing instant or two, make them sensible to one another. That dizzying folding together, you could say, is the secret subject of these essays as much as any heartbreak ballad, radiant passage or prose, or Joni song. Which is to say, these essays form cumulatively their own quiet brief on behalf of criticism, or at least of criticism in a certain mode, promiscuous in attention, prone to overheating in the agitated vernacular and wrought round with the interwoven dilemmas of worldly grief, local sorrow, ordinary blindsiding joy. These are pieces that approach a jumbled array of objects, chiefly by setting them back into the scenes in which they were found, and these range hectically from the private, like a kid's graduation, a divorce, to the exceedingly not private, an election or a pandemic, and trying to speak about them in the offhand idioms that circulated there. You will accordingly find a lot of room in here for immoderate devotion, lachrymose receptiveness, laughter unto illness, all sorts of sputtering wonder, as well as some boredom, some irritation, the lesser varieties of outrage, disbelief, disaffection. That, give or take, is the prevailing mode. What follow, in other words, are essays, shortish bursts of ardor and appraisal intertwining with life. So that's about the introduction, and one sort of, I guess I'll read the sort of small example of what one such essay might be. It's the title essay. It's called, Is There God After Prince? And unlike most of the essays, it was written like in a fevered rush of bewilderment and unhappiness on the afternoon and the night Prince died. So I'll just read from the beginning of that, and then Gus, you and I can talk some. So this is called Is There God After Prince? It's the Maine midwinter, hard frozen and dark. I'm trying to live through it as best I can, but it is not going entirely well. I am, in the first place, a newish arrival, which means that I am considerably less fluent in the protocols of madness deflection than I might be. But I am also, in my newness, another kind of unstudied. I have been actually employed as an actual professor at an actual college for about 6 months. And not for a moment have I been free of the sense of an imminent, disastrous exposure. Perhaps feeling an obvious fraud is a function of being in your first job. Whatever the case, adult professional life is for me a precarious sort of performance, brittle and unconvincing. I am 27 years old. It is inevitably 1999. But then, from deep in some yet unfrozen reservoir of optimism, a decision comes to me, a fateful decision. I decide that I will have a party. I decide that I will have a dance party. I decide to send a mass email to every person I've met and to many others I haven't. It reads, please come to my apartment on Cleveland Street for a party celebrating the 15th anniversary of Purple Rain. Any and all non-minors welcome. And so, on a February night at the back end of the Clinton era, a bunch of souls wandering out in a sleepy New England college town conspire to beguile an evening with whiskey, low-key drugs, many hours of in-house dancing in an underfurnished and overheating living room. Books piled in listing towers, boots and coats stacked in a jumble in the corners. I remember looking around me, seeing even the starchiest of my daylight colleagues and fledgling friends now sweat-soaked and giddy, teetering toward a Prince-induced euphoria, and thinking, oh, I can live here. Among the semi-acquaintances to show that night, one makes a special impression. She is the friend of friends and has come decked and ready to dance, despite the fact that she is, I know, in the latter days of what has been a hard and slow-moving divorce. Her ex must have the kids for the night. I tell her I'm glad she came. Later I will say, you walked in, I woke up. For years and years afterward, every midwinter, we'd throw dance parties, though these were a few blocks away, in the home she and I and her girls made for ourselves after we were married. Our friends knew these as Purple Rain nights, or more simply, Prince parties. A friend in England scored tickets a few summers ago to one of those impromptu solo gigs Prince had taken to performing, despite what was for me a near fatal onset of envy, or perhaps in order to express it. I wrote her a series of badgering emails. Tell me about the show, I said. What was it like? Her response was memorable. It was unlanguageable, she said. Also, I think I might be pregnant. In a similar, sadder way, this too, yesterday's awful, blindsiding tear in the fabric of things, is unlanguageable. There is, of course, the routinely undoing power of grief in response to deaths, no matter how mediated it is. God knows, an impressive quantity. And there is, too, the familiar drift of our metaphors in sorrow out toward the terrain of measure and measurelessness, the too huge influence, the too many songs, the too proliferating memories, the too vast territories of joy. I am with you, fellow grievers, in all this. I found out in a coffee shop, texting with a friend. I stood for about 10 minutes on the corner of Clark and Foster, weepy and paralyzed, unable to imagine what to do next. Was there eating lunch after Prince? After Prince, would we talk on phones? Take trains? Was there sex after Prince? I want to say a small word about this, our newest burden of the unassimilable. I'll just stop there.
Oh, it's so good. Thank you so much.
Yes,
Oh,
that's it.
Sad too.
Yeah.
Yeah, as I guess I want to come back to talk about Prince more specifically, but I guess, you know, I just wanted to start off by maybe asking you to talk a little bit about your style and your voice and this issue of feeling and
Yeah.
criticism. And people may have noticed from this reading that Pete's writing is not devoid of feeling. It doesn't really have a pretense towards that sort of critical objectivity that has been celebrated for a long time in academia. I guess my question is, how do you understand the relationship between feeling and emotion and this thing called criticism, like whatever that means, and how do your ideas about that shape what you believe criticism to be as a project?
Yeah, no, Gus, that's a great question. It sort of allows me to say, like, when I started writing in what for me was like a different mode, because I was like you, I was trained as an academic and I liked writing, but it occurred to me somewhere along the way of writing books about sex in the 19th century and stuff like that, which, I'd always say, I'm for. That's my position on sex in the 19th century. We're in favor of it. That a lot of the ways that, like you and probably like a lot of people here, that I learned what criticism might be or why one might be engaged by it was in deeply social scenes, was by talking about a book, or as it would be a song or a poem or a record, with friends, with other people who are interested in it, and generating around that object or that series of objects a lot of language, a lot of it more and less preposterous, but also pretty animated and engaging. And that gave me my real first taste of what critical practice could be. Like, when you're talking with people, you don't produce the same seriousness around it that you might say in the academic setting, but it was not, there's no enormous disjuncture between those settings, or there certainly wasn't for me. And it occurred to me after a while that I'd learned a lot about how to talk about objects from those scenes, which were precisely not cold. In fact, what I'd learned was that talking about objects was a way of falling in love with people, of making them your friends, and of holding that friendship together. So that became a way of like, oh, there are probably some clarities to be found in that particular way of discoursing, which I like so much, which has always made me so happy. What would it mean to try to write in relation to that voice, rather than the voice that I use when I'm like behind a podium, or when I'm like teaching kids about meter or something like that? And that just became sort of interesting. But the larger truth is that, for stupid private reasons, the things that I was most compelled to write about were like love / ruination of, and sorrow and grief, and like trying to encounter these objects again in a state of sort of or ordinary life turmoil, but also what felt like emotional extremity. And it seemed to me that this kind of writing and that kind of talking was good at doing two things that academic writing wasn't necessarily well trained for, which is talking about love and talking about sorrow. And those things became very important to me. And so that is how writing in this other sort of mode really got underway. But I guess I'll say, to sort of wrap it around, that it's not like you leave your mind behind. It's not like you leave your training behind exactly. Being trained in queer theory made me want to think a lot about the sort of ad hoc worlds one makes around object. But I'll also say, spending a decade or so writing like this, you realize that loving an object is super not the same as like approving of it. Or rather, you realize that there's just an awful lot inside your attachment to an object, like dread, like sorrow, like grief, like desire, like regret. There's a lot of politics in it. And that way of being attached to objects got more and more intricate to me. And in that respect, something I would want more and more to write about, and to find ways of making its own attachments or places in a life filled with ordinary loves and sorrows vivid. So that's the sort of roundabout explanation. Didn't say much about style per se, but
well, I guess I would just follow that. I mean, I want to say, I think it's really what's amazingly striking about the book is just it really is a kind of compendium of different manifestations of love, of objects, of people as well, of different kinds of love relationships with love partners, with children, stepchildren in your case, with family, friends, and then of course with various forms of representation, of which music is probably the foremost one in this volume. So I kind of just wanted to push you. I mean, and it really does. I mean, there is this wonderful fluidity between all of these different kinds of love and the way that the book unfolds. And in just what you say, like it feels like the focus is really on relations and relationships. Nonetheless, just to sort of push you in a maybe like more mundane direction. What is it about what is it about music? What is it, like, I mean, I feel like you're hesitant to talk about, like,
no.
Okay. But like, what is it about music that, I mean, I know that's a huge question or whatever, but that makes it such a generative and just dynamic medium for you, or object for you.
So a friend of mine,
I guess pop music, really, right?
Very, like, I have minor fluencies, but like pop music. A friend of mine said this very nice thing about the book when we were talking about it, which that seems very much a book about adolescence, like a book very much about adolescence, not just because my stepdaughters were adolescents during a lot of its writing, but that's the best way I know how to answer that question, Gus's question about like why music, because one way to think about it is like adolescence is, among other things, a time when your desire for precisely love that lives outside the family, which you can call sex, but you can call by a number of names, but sex is a perfectly good one, is so outsized and is so roiling and is so baffling, and is also, in most cases, and certainly my own, almost wholly inaccessible to you. Like you're overfilled with this hunger for the world, for this turbulent hunger for the world, and it has no place to go. And one of the astonishing things about songs is that they hold all of it. They're capable of holding all. There's no, or for me, I'll say there was never any breadth of affective yearning that felt too large for a song to hold. And in fact, songs were so capacious. They made such astonishing room for it, and they would act, it would later occur to me, as a kind of placeholder. Like even when there were no persons to hold on to and recognize in you that want and that need and that ardor and that fear or that dread, songs like a miracle from the world could do that. And that exchange, I think, for a lot of us, felt enormously galvanizing. It made the world seem possible. It made the world seem workable. And it seems to me, I think I say somewhere in the book, that anybody who into their, now you and I in our 50s or whatever, continues to love pop songs with that kind of like somewhat preposterous outsized ardor, knows what that's like, knows what that scene of like thwarted neediness being answered by something is like. And they're like, of course I love novels and of course I love poems, and there's ways of describing my relations to those that are similar, but nothing has done that so persistently as songs. And then of course the other side of that is you grow your life and you fall in love with people and you make friends with people, and the songs that you share with one another or that evoke those contexts like nothing but else are inside those loves. And again, there's few things that do that as persuasively to me or as songs do, as records do. So those are, I guess, the two things about music particularly. First, they allow you to believe in the possibilities of love when there's really no evidence on the ground, besides your family, which is precisely what you don't want at the time. And two, they allow you to like nurture and sustain those loves over the course of distance, like Gus, you sent me a playlist in the beginning of the pandemic, and that just made me feel very like, okay, we're still in this, so that those would be my two kinds of again, amateurish answers to why songs, why records.
Yeah, no, that's great. And I think, I mean, something that I think is another dimension of this that you get into in the book, I mean, especially in one essay in particular, but I think in other ones as well, is I think maybe I mean, I love how you talked about cathecting pop music as like an adolescent or a kid, and it's just so perfectly fits my own experience of that. But something else that you talk about as a way that adults kind of experience pop music is the argument. And
Yeah,
you're very much in
hallowed
favor
form.
of the argument, the kind of like knockdown, drag out, vehement argument about a band, about a song. I wonder if you could talk about that as a form in itself.
Yeah,
You seem to
yeah.
think of it as kind of like a cultural form in itself.
Yeah, I mean, one thing I'll say about it is it's limited, and we know that there's like it's not just boys, obviously, but there's a certain kind of boy that you and I encountered in graduate school, for whom the argument was really just like less an argument than like a series of knife fights. And that was never really my thing. Like my favorite kind of argument would be one where you're sort of like everybody's in on it together. And that permits a kind of fractiousness that's not the same thing as a sort of dick swinging self aggrandizement. And that's not easy. Those differences aren't always easy to tell. And I feel like one of the ways that I've found myself loving the boys that I've loved have been people who would like enter into a scene of argument without that particular kind of aggression that I identify, unfortunately, with a certain kind of theory and a certain kind of graduate school in the 90s. But that the particular kinds of self-revelation that happen, the ways that you and your friends reveal yourself to one another by just hard disputing over something, has always been really delighting to me. As part of it's always seemed like a kind of love song. It's one of the ways you love each other is by recognizing not just that you share your relation to X thing, but that you, person I love, your relation to X thing is totally mystifying to me. Like, it's astonishing to me that you, of all the things, you would pick that thing to love. That, again, has made a lot of space for me. It has made a lot of life in and with the people I care about. And of course, that's not just about records. That's about movies. That's about characters in novels. It's about styles that we find more and less tolerable. And that sort of vernacular aesthetic appraisal, what Dave Hickey, an art critic, calls the street level negotiation of value, it's always meant a lot to me. Like, it has so obviously dickish extensions that have everything to do with kind of like performances of boyness, and especially around music. But I didn't want to let those particular kinds of exactly Gus, exactly
Yeah.
you know.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that another kind of, for me, odious version of that is well, what I love also is that the way you talk about argument is it's not about consumption in a way. Like, I sort of, that there's a whole other version of this that I find sort of very off-putting, about kind of connoisseurship and what's the best this and what's the best that, and what's the best coffee, what's the best oat milk, all that stuff, which also seems like something some people really enjoy having those kinds of arguments.
Yeah, and I don't have I mean, I don't know, man. I guess this is another thing to say about songs and pop music. Like, I feel like I genuinely feel credentialed about some things. Like, if you and I were going to talk about like the 19th century, I would feel like, okay, I've learned a lot about that. I'm credentialed in that conversation. Or if I were to talk about like secularism and the Mormons or something like that. But I think, I don't know, man, like, that's a weird way to relate to pop songs. And it's not the most, like, one of the great things about pop music is its invitation to shed exactly that sort of like the kind of connoisseurship that you're describing, because it's understood to be too cheap and flimsy an object to produce that kind of connoisseurship. That's very appealing. I've never quite had with the exception of like 19th century America, I haven't had quite the assurance to feel like a connoisseur about much, like, I don't know, like red sauce, like Italian things, I guess I could, but you know what I mean? And pop songs are in I think you're describing back to me like, well, why I felt like I could have great vehemence around them is because I felt like the entrance fee was really low. And there was a permission in that. And to have other people respond to that permission with a sort of like generosity, like a generosity that mirrors the generosity of the object.
Right.
That's like a happy night at the bar, you know?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
You mentioned something about one of the main focuses of your academic scholarly work as secularism, and that just makes me think of, I wanted to come back to Prince, and think of this, wonderful line from your book, which I may miss a couple of words from, but you say Prince is the least secular rock star that we have, or that we've ever
known.
We've ever known. I wonder if you could talk about what you mean by this. This is coming back to the beginning, your reading and the title and everything.
Yeah, I kind of don't mean, and this is a whole, like, this is the, like, I don't really mean like he's the most religious. There's plenty of religious pop stars. I mean that among the things you could say about the order of liberal rationality that we call secularism, and I'm just going to riff on our beloved friend John Modern, with whom I've had a lot of engaging conversations like this. One of the things that a secular order of things will do is make the human the measure of all that there is, and make human rationality the sign of what is possible. And I feel like Prince has forever been absolute radiant confoundment to that. That Gus, you made clear to me when you gave the talk in the critical karaoke about Prince, about Case of You, that there's always been something absolutely otherworldly, shading off into incomprehensibility about Prince. And that was part of its rapturous gorgeousness. Sometimes it's silly. Sometimes it's like the Dave Chappelle, like, this is a weird man. And sometimes it's just like enchantment itself. Sometimes it's just a radiance that exhausts all the proximate, merely worldly languages of apprehension. And that is what I meant, for Prince, certainly God was one of the signs of an order of being that was not exhausted by the terms of the world.
I mean, again, I might push you a little more, like, towards the object. In this case, Prince himself. Like, what can you say more about him as a musician, as a figure, as a performer? What it was really about him, and what it continues to be in his music that has this kind of effect.
Yeah, I mean, people will have a better formal vocabulary than I might, but the unearthly synthesizing power, so that you can listen to a Prince song and hear 100 years of popular and also non-popular music condensed and clarified as like hook, as just like, you know what I mean? Like, to translate into the idiom of pop song an unbelievable density, not only of inherences, but of affects that don't often appear in pop songs, like his coy, recessed flirtatiousness. That's not like the synthesizing power, I guess I would say, of his style as a composer and as a person who imagines the parameters of pop songs. That is a little abstract, but if we were listening to a particular song, we could get like just the shuttling between something that's so insanely fluent and acrobatically artful, but also silly, like that's like the puncturing of his own stuff with little bits of silliness and a particular style of flirtation. Let me have a fruit cocktail, says in Dorothy Parker. You know what I mean? Shit like that.
Right. Yeah.
Like,
no,
which
I
would, yeah.
I love that you're using the word silly, and which is not a word I've heard, really applied to him before, but it does really fit something about his kind of like very self-confident, but self-awareness of himself as a performer, as an entertainer, and there is, I think, in that a lot of a sense of history and
Yeah,
context, etc.
I mean, I'll say I steal the word from Auden, who in his unbelievably beautiful elegy for Yeats has that line, "You were silly like us," which is so beautiful. You were silly like us. Your
Yeah,
gift survived it all. You were silly like us. Silly is
yeah,
such a, and there that you can, like, that triangulates into place, like the astonishment of Yeats and his bonkers synthesizing power, and Prince and his capacity for funniness and for self-deprecation
play.
and
Yeah,
for play, even inside like the sounds of exaltation, or the
yeah,
sounds of just filthiness. Just, yeah, the one way to say is the confounding of the purely earthly, the carnal, and the like rising up. Again, I know that I'm certain in this room there are people with vastly sharper formal vocabularies than mine. We would meet on the dance floor on this, I feel like.
yeah. Well, yeah, I think silly should be part of that arsenal of critical terms for sure. I think another thing that comes up in the book, sort of, after reading, a number of the essays, is that another one of your concerns really has to do with kind of generations and aging, and I mean, both like, yeah, both yourself, like growing up, and then also your relationship to your stepdaughters.
Yeah.
And I guess I just, it's an interesting topic around which to think about music, because I think, I mean, music can become so weighted down with nostalgia, or the way that
Yeah.
one thinks about songs that one, loved at a particular age can sometimes become like a way to not listen to any new
Yeah.
music,
Yeah. No,
like,
totally.
and I guess I was just curious to hear you talk a little bit about
Yeah.
that, and like how to resist that, I guess, in some ways too.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting. As a friend of mine, or I don't know if she said it or I said it, we used to talk, this is back when I was at Bowdoin years ago. I guess I said it in cars. It's as though, like, for some people, the last time, in a way I find sort of moving, the last time they stopped listening to new music and stopped like seeking out new music when they fell in love for the last time.
Mm.
And I was sort of compelled by that, like, oh, and then and there's a cynical way of thinking about, oh, and then like marriage and blah, 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 and all the normativities that follow therefrom. But I also think, like, well, no, like there's a certain sort of hunger that was satisfied then, and then there's sort of a pleasing nostalgia. I don't think you and I are quite like that. But again, we were talking a little bit the other day, like, as people for whom the 90s, for all their foibles and whatever, were super important, it's nothing if not weird to watch its cyclical uptake by people younger than us. My stepdaughters are now astonishingly 29 and about to be 27, and for a while in their early 20s, i.e., in the 2000 teens, the 90s were like a real like thing that you would think about, and you'd wear the stuff, and you'd like get into Noodle Milk Hotel. And I don't know that I have a good answer about how to avoid it so much, as other than to be on guard with oneself. But I do think a lot about the things that one does and does not carry forward. I'm struck, another way to say, is by the things from an era that I felt very inside and very alive in that remain current, and the things that don't.
Mm-hmm.
Like, part of the reason I ended up writing about Pavement is, as you know, not because I crazy loved Pavement. They were a fine band who I enjoyed and enjoy. But their sort of demi-deification was weird to me. Even as it was happening, it was weird to me. You could say something similar about Neutral Milk Hotel. There was nothing inevitable, it seemed to me, in the moment that they would be the face of that sort of iconicity.
Mhm.
And that became sort of interesting, particularly around young people. Like a lot of because we're teachers, you're around young people all the time. And I guess this is a way of answering the question about nostalgia. Like, one thing among the litany of things that my stepdaughters taught me was to try not to be too prescriptive, to try not to correct them, like to just like hold to the sense that the things that they like have clarities of their own, and they probably don't need me offering like byways to the passages of cool. You know what I mean? Like, we can exchange things and stuff like that, but that has to be a very delicate exchange. And I guess there's a certain kind of self-insistence in nostalgia that if you're around children of a certain age, like teenagers and stuff like that, you stay the fuck away from, because they have they're incredibly attuned to it. And it just shuts things down, not at all unreasonably. Yeah,
that's great. I'm tempted to ask you to read another part of the book, actually, because that reminds me of this really gorgeous part. And then we can kind of move maybe towards a free discussion. But it's about this. It's on page 123.
123. Looking at your books. Oh, this is that. Yeah. This is the essay about the. Yeah.
Like the
essay about Third Eye Blind.
To the end of that section.
Oh, you want that section? Okay.
Oh, do you
No, totally. Okay, this is
it's always easy to mock the young.
Yeah. I'll frame this out a little. This is an essay that begins with me and my youngest stepdaughter at a bar, and we're talking together about music, and she's probably 14, 15. Anyway, this is the little interlude in that before we get on to talking about other stuff like Kanye West and Third Eye Blind. Okay, so it's always easy to mock the young, their untutored enthusiasms, their volatility, their assurance in the face of complexities inadequately grasped. Pick your liability. No one, I suspect, not even the most kindly disposed among us, would say there is nothing to cause impatience in any of this, or irritation, or an elderly roll of the eyes. And yet, at just this moment, that default condescension has an ugly edge to it. We are greeted almost daily with news of fervent protest and equally fervent demand, often initiated and sustained by young people. Think of Ferguson, Baltimore, of Parkland. This is so much the case that the public ritual of worrying over the misguidedness of the youth has become a veritable cottage industry that takes coming fast and hot. Some are quite thoughtful, some are, in regard to the hue and cry, thoughtfully skeptical, and then some are just dog whistles. Witness now the chorus of voices bravely standing up to chastise snowflakes, their thin-skinned preciousness, or, in something of an under-remarked paradox, to bemoan the furious assault on time-honored and sacrosanct values being perpetuated by the ruthless young. Others have described more exactingly than I can the hollownesses of these attacks, penned often by what the redoubtable Joshua Clover calls, quote, concerned trolls and free speech bros. The collective moral for me has been try to be on the side of young people. Now, as in the past, you can do a lot worse by way of first premises. But if you're old, or even just older, the temptation to correct and cajole, to instruct, can be irresistibly great. I confess I have a lot of respect for that pedagogical impulse, perhaps more than I should. There is, after all, a disequilibrium built into relations between the older and the younger. Sometimes being young means actually needing the care, the solicitude, and even the words of older people. Not always, but sometimes. Knowing when this is so and when it is not can be on both sides chancier than you'd imagine. For older people, the turn towards solicitude can feel at moments less like condescension than like a responsible discharge of the obligations of adulthood. Like, in fact, love. You don't spend the time many of us do talking with young people about ideas and reading their writing and writing back to them without being pulled at least a bit in the riptides of these contrary impulses. Here's a thing about step-parenthood, and its wrought unpatterned strangenesses. It speaks up, it instructs at the oddest, most unpredicted junctures. And one of the things you can learn from it, I am here to tell you, is that the pedagogical impulse, no matter how generously or intended or italicized by love, is probably best resisted. The young people have languages of their own. Yeah, and then what follows is a bunch of cool teenagers.
And a great rendering of a Third Eye Blind, the do. Like, I was very impressed by it. Really,
Thank you. Yeah,
really
yeah. If it does nothing else, if you really want some Third Eye Blind disquisitions, this is the book you've been waiting for.
Yeah, but I guess that does bring up one last thing I wanted to ask you about. I mean, because thinking about what it's like to be older and be around a lot of younger people as we do as teachers, and then many of us have children in our lives, with nieces, nephews, not actual children that we parented. The book is, I mean, the subtitle of the book is Dispatches from an Age of Last Things, and there's a very dark edge to the book. I mean, which is, I don't think we are really doing justice to, for
you're not wrong,
understandable reasons, but it does bring up that, I mean, it does, I think in that passage you talk about resisting that pedagogical impulse. And yet, like, I don't know, I often feel puzzled about how to talk to my students about the horribleness of the world, and and just how I feel terrible for them. And I guess I'm curious sort of what you think. I mean, I guess on one hand, I'm curious for you to just talk about like writing under that dark cloud, but also maybe more specifically, like, in your thinking, is there any kind of like of a do you have any tips? Do you have any like thoughts about, I mean, how do you live as an older person, or middle-aged to older person, with the world crumbling around you, and with these young people who are so bright and so enthusiastic and just thoughtful? And what do you do?
I mean, I guess I'll
maybe, how does music fit in that too, man?
No, I guess I'll answer quickly in two ways. It is true that we've talked a lot about joyousness, but it's a sort of, as I've said to other people, it's like a very downhearted book about joy. And what it ends up being fascinated with a lot is like what the state of apprehension that prevails in a world, some aspects of whose future we do not know. Like, without me telling you, the climatological estimates of 2050, which is not that long away. That the middle of the road UN estimates are like 1 billion displaced persons. That this accelerates rather than decelerates. The fascist turn of the last, say, 8 years. All this stuff is stuff. How to know and unknow that at the same time is a sort of object of real fascination, or what one does with a kind of knowledge that is impossible to absorb in its completion, is not yet repressed, but is not yet transformed into knowledge. That's a lot of what the book is about, and it seems to me objects are always turning around one's difficult relation. About the talking to young people, I'll just say a thing that that I always think about, that my oldest stepdaughter said when she was living out here in Chicago for a year, which was awesome, except it was during the pandemic, so that sucked. And I was saying to her and her boyfriend, who were, I don't know, 25, 26 at the time, like, oh my God, can you imagine being 16 or 17? I know some of you had kids who were 16 or 17. My blessings upon you. That sounds like a particular kind of horror. So I was saying this to them, like, what would it be like? What do you think it would be like to have the world shut down in this terrifying way when you're 16 or 17? And without being like emo or self-dramatizing or anything like that, they just offhandedly said, oh, well, I mean, something much worse will happen. So, you know, it'll just be an early iteration of something. And there was no like melodrama about it, just an absolute assurance about, well, this is the sort of pattern of things. And that was very jarring, but also let me know that the young people have styles of apprehension that my own might be adjacent to, but they're not identical to, and I don't see fully into them. They don't transpire in some like black box of mystery, but they are their own. And yeah, my quite inadequate answer is to just sort of like love them in and through that and celebrate they both became big union people, of course, because that seemed like a way of ameliorating the world. But you know, yeah, that's the closest I can come to adequacy, which is of course a lot of the book is about like when I say that loving things can also have sorrow and hurt in it, part of what I mean is that you can love, like we were talking about the other day, Shane McGowan. We were talking about the moment in that song where Shane's voice comes in the Birmingham Six, and it's so booming and huge, and it makes anti-colonial rage seem like the size of the whole planet and absolutely irresistible. And you can experience that and recognize its inadequacy to the scale of the world's disaster, and that will fill you with grief as much as joy. That will fill you with a sense of Adornian dislocation. And that's a lot of what the latter half of the book certainly is about. Doesn't give you any help, Gus, in talking to the beautiful, brilliant young people.
It does.
Yeah.
I think we should thank you so much. Let's
thank you.
To the people here.
Yeah, so I am keeping the queue for the Q&A, and let's see. Well, Carl, you didn't have quite a question. You had a comment about distinguishing between criticism not necessarily being about proving or disapproving of what it scrutinizes. Do you want to speak to that, or do you want to go on to another more question you had later?
Yeah, I'm still formulating questions. That was really just a like verbal applause for a turn of phrase of Pete's. But go to somebody else first, and I'm going to be thinking about questions.
No doubt. Okay, so Ian, do you want to unmute and ask your question?
Thanks. Whoops. Hi again, Pete. A pleasure as always. So I'll just read what I wrote. I'd like to ask about the possible differences between writing about objects that are loved and objects that are sources of non-lovely agitation.
Mm-hmm.
From what I know of your writing, so switching to the second person, what I know of your writing, both are objects of impassioned attention and probing, but are there differences in the process or protocols of writing, or something else I'm not really imagining?
Yeah, that's Ian. What a great question. Let me see how I would try to answer that. Well, the interest of both, I guess one thing to say is I'm not, unlike some of the people we know and love, I'm not really a polemicist. So like the practice of windmill dunking on things is not that, like, though it is incredibly edifying and people who do it well are electrifying, it's not really my thing. Though, which is another way of saying the prompt for both objects of a sort of loving ardor and a more hating ardor would seem to be how it connects you to other people. Lara Cohen, Brian Connolly write so smartly about hating things as precisely a scene of sociability, and I'm very struck by that. And I guess I'm also struck by the book sort of ends with a faltering admission that it's probably not the best thing about me as a critic, that if I'm left alone with something for a while, I will probably want to tend toward an account of its like misplaced grace or its misunderstood power. And that's like not always a helpful disposition, because some things are malignant and should best be described that way. So I guess one thing to say is like, I think if I really wanted to talk about something I fucking hated, I would have to go at it with that, like with this sort of like the kill switch on, you know what I mean? Which would be different, and something I'm unused to and possibly ill-suited to. Yeah, the most polemicizing I do would be about a particular like overclass in the book, but that's easy, you know, like who doesn't hate the billionaire class? But its objects would be, I guess, Ian, actually, now that I'm talking, I'll say another thing and then I'll stop talking, which is that a part of me is hesitant around it because of how well I know how much I love stuff that people can absolutely rightfully hate the shit out of. And I'm anxious not to just accept, like not like everybody's like hunky-dory, but not to traduce the scene of someone else's attachment. I may want to contest its terms. That's fun, you know? Like we do that all the time. But a part of me wants to sort of leave protected the space of somebody's like, yeah. That's I guess what I'd say. Thank you. That's a good question.
Thanks a lot. I would just say, like, the writers that I love are all over the place on this question. Like Hazlitt has a great essay called "The Pleasure of Hating." It's really terrific. And Derrida said, I forget if it's written down or somewhere. He said, "I never wrote about anything that I didn't love."
Did he really?
He said that, and he, you know, he wrote some pretty polemical stuff. Also.
Yeah. Not a person shy of the polemic.
Yeah. So
anyway,
thanks a lot.
Yeah. No, thank you, Ian. That question helped me say something, which is that, like, for good or ill, I think I try to hold a little space around other people's attachments to things, in full recognition that my own are indefensible and preposterous. You know.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. John, do you want to unmute and ask your question?
Yeah, hi. I've really enjoyed this conversation, and I feel like I'm doing some essay writing in a kind of similar direction, and so I'm interested to know this kind of combination of criticism and what I think of as the personal essay with a close consideration of what objects mean to us. I'm just wondering if you feel there are precedents to this type of writing that you're doing that you could name, like writers or?
Yeah, that's a spectacular question, and the answer is really yes, really yes. H is for Hawk. Do you know the
Yes.
Helen McDonald novel, or the Helen McDonald novel, the Helen McDonald memoir and book? Like the big thing I ever did about this was a memoir, which was about getting divorced and music and stepchildren. And I would say, I want to write H's for Hawk, but I want it, instead of it being about like literary biography, naturalism, and a grief memoir, I want it to be about divorce, step-parenthood, and Carly Rae Jepsen. That was my like, but that's a real, like, an absolute model. But there's so many critics who I loved so much. Hanif Abdurraqib is a beautiful, beautiful example of this, even like super dated, but like that 70s school, like Ellen Willis, Grail Marcus, Lester Bangs, much less so Grail Marcus, but Lester Bangs was like writing about scenes was also a way of doing a kind of personal writing. I'll say that I had no pretensions to, I had no particular desires to write personal essays, but I wanted to write about records, and I wanted to write about love and sorrow, and that became a thing that I started to do. But there lots of people I was just in, and still am in, just like faltering imitation of. Weirdly, other people I think of are like academic-y people, like Eve Sedgwick and Hortense Spillers and Adam Phillips. They meant so much to me when I was young and really absorbing stuff, and their sort of sense that that life was a thing that theory touched and reverse, that meant a lot to me. That sort of stuff meant a lot to me.
It's
Yeah.
great to hear you mention Hanifa Jurabkib, because the first thing I thought of when you started talking was I've
Yeah.
just finished reading A Little Devil in America, and I guess
Yeah.
there's a whole bunch of us who are in love with his writing.
Yeah, tremendously. Gus, it's late at night, so I'm blank on the name. Snaz for Jukebox, Jeff O'Brien. Is that who that is? Like, there's just a storied history of people managing to write something about their lives or about other people's lives by attending to objects. But I will really say, though I know nothing about naturalism or hawks or England, H is for Hawk was to me a really intensely it was galvanizing. You know what I mean? Like, oh, I do a totally different thing, but I would want people who don't give a fuck about Pavement to want to find something in the book. You know what I mean? So yeah, thank you very much for that question.
Okay, and the next question is from me. Is there some disconnect between how academics view Prince and music journalists, not to overstate the boundary between those groups? I'm thinking about the series of conferences that have happened in academia about Prince that speak to his importance, but I don't know of journalism that refers to Prince as monumental in this way. I'm thinking about, like, the place of Madonna and the place of Michael Jackson, and it feels like music journalism comes back to particular figures, but I say that I may be missing stuff, but somehow I think Prince's influentialness, or there's not as many think pieces about Prince, but I could be wrong.
That's amazing.
Is taking it up.
That's super interesting. I think you would probably know better than I would, but that's super interesting because, of course, I think, like, God bless Michael Jackson, God bless Madonna, no hate, but like, they do not. They're not as, they don't hold in my pantheon of 21st century artists the same sort of status. They just don't. They just don't. I don't know. It's a good question about why academics would take up Prince. I'm not entirely sure what the answer is. Some of it would be like that, like, so many different critical idioms, they don't break against him, they leap up. Like, if you want to talk about queer theory, if you want to talk about queer theory and its attachment to queer of color critique, like, Prince just goes like this. It's just combustible, So you can do so much with it. And I think for academics, especially academics who don't often feel like they have that degree of ardor, they don't have a place to go with it, Prince is a great, great, great object. I don't know the journalism question because I'm such a sort of novice. I don't know what the answer to that is, because that seems super off kilter to me, like, yeah. That's off kilter to me. I was, it was not that way. I was reading in Minneapolis. It wasn't that way there. Like, that was very heartening. Yeah.
Yeah, no slander to journalists. I could be just not as well read with journalism as I am with academia, but thank you for that answer. Let's see. And then Carl, your question.
Yeah, I mean, this risks getting too broadly thematic, but I want to talk more about this question of sort of being under the sign of disaster.
Yeah.
Part of me wants to dispute it a little bit and say that every generation feels this, whatever the facts might be, and it's constantly a condition that we operate under. But putting that aside and kind of taking the premises read, I think all of us contend with this question of how do we justify this life of talking about culture in circumstances where there are these emergencies constantly happening. And so I wonder how you think about that. And secondarily, what pieces of culture or kinds of culture do you feel like speak to that concern the most for you?
Yeah, all those are great questions. And on the first one, there's much one could say about, like, I was talking to medievalist, was like, dude, the 21st century did not invent eschatology. And that's true, though I think we could then we had a good conversation about what it means to be at the end of something. So, but about the second thing, I mean, there's not a lot of justification in the book, in part because it begins by saying a thing I'm not interested in doing, really not interested in doing, is making a case for like the expansive political utility or redemptive power of art objects. Not that they do nothing, that would not be my claim, it'd be weird to make that claim, but that not doing nothing is different from political utility and redemptiveness at the scale of the world. And indeed, the sort of shocking gap between the miraculous, the humanly miraculous things that a song can do, that a fifth leap in Billie Holiday's voice when she's growling will do. The fact that they don't scale up to the world is part of the object, is part of what you're feeling so viscerally. So it's I'm really committed to not like producing what is finally a belittling valorization of either the object or criticism. Oh my God, though, dude, as for things that like speak to me about the yawning chasm between what seems to be happening in the world and our actual ability to conceive it, there are a lot, weirdly, I'll say, I'm sort of proud in an unseemly way about a piece about The Shining, which is a movie about a family who cannot bear to know what they know is happening. And it's incredibly moving. Unlike most Kubrick, it's not cold. I mean, it's cold, but it's incredibly loving toward Danny, the person who's being hurt. And I think it is an astonishing piece of art about an incapacity to know what you also know, because it's too much is at stake in that. That's one thing. Of all things, in a much more comic key, The Sopranos helped me do that, seeing the now dead but then vibrantly alive James Gandolfini and thinking of that in relation to my left behind and missed Italian East Coast family. A better way to say it is, so many of our objects perform for us a vibrant state of partial, blocked, or incomplete knowing. And that has become really enabling. Not enabling is probably the wrong word, because it doesn't enable anything much other than more thinking, but I'm never going to be a person who says like thinking is nothing. It's not the scale of the world. But I will, a phrase another person I was reading with said, one of your favorite phrases in this book is not nothing. That's where most of this resides for me. Yeah. Carl, thanks very much for that question.
Thanks so much.
Mark, can you unmute and ask your question?
Yeah. So, Peter, you talked about how a lot of this is expressed very strongly in the adolescent years, and I was wondering if you could speak to about how some of this might have to do with identification with artists and musicians who are public-facing figures in a way that, say, novelists aren't. We hear their voices, we see them live, we might see them in videos. And, you know, for example, I imagine your interest in Prince has to do with your own life as a queer man. And you see this very powerfully, I think, in the Dylan fandom, where a lot of people who are into Dylan have certain personality traits that I think they find relatable.
That's super interesting. I should say, well, like a whole host of things. I don't know how much that is the case for me, though. As soon as I say that, I like that can't quite be true. There's a whole chapter in the book about loving this guy named John Darnielle, who is the Mountain Goats, who's just like a dorky book reading guy who I met in a bar because I went to see him. So that's obviously not entirely the case. I will say that when I was an adolescent, it was certainly less that than songs were the promise of a world that was nothing like the one I was in. Not because it was bad. Not because it was bad. I have a very loving family, et cetera, et cetera. Like I'm generally, through no virtue of my own, like a happy kid, et cetera. But man, was it not the whole world. And rather than a particular figure, songs promised the world. Though, but it's funny that what you say, I think, as I got older, I think there was something about how certain people held themselves in the world that was admirable, because of course I didn't really know how to do it, you know, and that's, yeah, that's a way that's making me think about my own attachments in such in a lot of ways, you know. Like Gus and I were talking about bands we used to listen to a lot, don't listen to so much anymore. There was really a time when I listened to the National a lot, because fucking of course I did. I just gotten divorced. Like, it was like, you know, and that again suggests exactly the thing you're saying, that there was a part of, if not their persona, something about how that persona was tuned toward the world that attracted me. That's a sharp way of saying. About novelists, that's a different question. I don't know. I don't know. The things that always captured me about novelists, honestly, were not their persona. It was really their like syntax, you know, like the scene of sentence making was the scene of the greatest identification, which is I think you're exactly right, a different order than identifying with pop stars and musicians. Yeah, thank you very much for that. I don't know if the dude from the National actually got divorced. It was just such like sad middle-aged white guy music. It just came for me, you know. I was powerless.
For me too, unfortunately.
Right? Like when you're feeling like, oh my God, when you're a little heartbroken, that particular like baritone melancholy, oh, daggers.
He's so sad about it all. And so am I. Troy, do you want to ask your question?
Absolutely. Fascinating discussion. I can't help but think about myself, a young gay boy from Wisconsin who somehow connected to Mariah Carey. And there's a saying that every young gay boy finds their diva in their adolescence. And Mariah was mine. So fascinating. Wanted to talk about the pressures that are on young artists, because I know at 31, and I said this in my comment, I know too much to be young, but too little to be enough. And there are these young artists now who are expected by this Generation Z millennial audience to have points of view on the end of the age, right? And so how could you speak on that kind of pressure? And of course, we've seen that through Motown and Marvin Gaye releasing What's Going On. And so we've seen artists who've had to respond to the cultural zeitgeist in their moment. But this particular generation, how are they navigating that? Could you speak on that?
Yeah, that's a great, because again, I think other people who are closer to like the field and to journalism will be better able to answer that. The obvious thing to say, which is true, is I do not envy them. I do not envy trying to conjure worlds in the scene of their collapse. That said, there's a lot of beautiful stuff. There's just so much beautiful stuff that young people seem to be making, not without regard for an impending world, you know what I mean? It's funny, it's weird. I'm not thinking of pop stars. One of the people that I write about in the book is Sally Rooney, who's a very young novelist, you know, Irish novelist. And those novels are so much about decathecting the promises, a variety of promises of futurity in what for her was like around the crash era Ireland. And she's made these beautiful, eerie, challenging, cold monuments out of that decathexis. So one answer might be the kinds of decathexis of promises of futurity that took me 20 years to accomplish. Younger people will just be cagier. And the things they will make out of that withdrawal from these given scripts of the future will be super interesting. That would be that would be one guess. But of course, I don't know, whatever I imagine, they're absolutely going to outpace, you know, by virtue of them being young and having an angle on the world that I'll be trailing behind. Now you're just hearing me talk about my grown-up stepdaughters, whose angle on the world is something I feel like I'm super invested in and filled with all this protective love around, but which I'm trailing behind. Yeah, thank you very much for that question.
Thank you.
We might be at the end of our questions, I think.
Okay.
All right.
Well, this was a joy.
Thank you so much. It's been a wonderful session. Wow.
I haven't been able to look in the chat, so I'm sorry. I will
Yeah, I'm kind of
try to get hold of it later, but I haven't meant to
Yeah.
ignore anybody. I super appreciate getting to do this and getting to talk to anybody. If anyone is in Princeton, New Jersey, gonna be reading there with the great Lindsay Rexon Thursday night. Bless. Come on by.